Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. Happy to have everyone tonight who was able to make it. And we have a great session. So for anyone who is here as a first timer, welcome. And for our returning members, glad to see you again. So for tonight's agenda, we'll be doing some brief introductions and administrative items, and then we'll dive right into the presentation presented tonight by Ian Leatherman on Zero Trust and Chaos Engineering, which should be a great session. And then we'll wrap up with a few closing words and certainly have some time available for any questions and answers and discussion that folks want to have. For those who are new, our community is organized to provide a venue for networking, information sharing, and professional development across folks who have interest in both the Microsoft 365 platform as well as its applications within for government and public sector spaces. There's a few things I want to just remind everyone of in terms of our community standards. These should be fairly obvious and no-brainers, but please be respectful and considerate to other members. Don't share any non-public, proprietary, or controlled information. While we certainly welcome folks who want to share sales, marketing, employment, or other information as part of the work they're doing, please keep that appropriate and limited. So no spamming or otherwise excessive promotion, but you certainly are welcome to share that sort of content. And it is very important to remind that while some of the participants may either be employees of Microsoft, such as myself, or other companies or organizations, that everyone here is here in their personal capacity and reflects their personal views, experience, and opinions, not the opinions or views of their employer or any organization. I also want to introduce and thank two of my co-organizers, Andrew Kagan and Andy Oak, who've been great collaborators from Planet Technology in helping to facilitate and run these sessions. And as well as if you are interested in volunteering or helping to coordinate these sessions, we would love to have you. So feel free to contact one of us offline if there's something you'd like to do, either a small or large part, to help coordinate these sessions. Just to introduce myself, I'm Nick Giard. I'm a program manager with Microsoft Engineering in the government space. If you would like to reach out to me on social media, here's my contact information. I don't want to spend too much time on myself, but for anyone who would like my information, here it is. For anyone who is new to Teams as a meeting platform, hopefully everything is relatively intuitive. Probably the most important thing will be the raise hand function and the chat window, so you can see those up in the toolbar. Once the meeting gets started, I will, and the presenter will put it into moderated mode. So if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand functionality. As soon as appropriate, a moderator will allow you to unmute. Then you can ask your question. If you'd feel more comfortable putting questions or comments in the chat window, you can certainly do that, and we will then read them off kind of in the order they're received. Our next event is going to be May 18th at 5 p.m. We're going to be doing a session geared on returning to work with Microsoft Teams and looking at some of the things like conference room and phones and other collaboration capabilities that really apply more in an in-person office space as folks start to look at moving more and more back into the office rather than being virtual and remote. And if you have a content that you would like to present at a future session, please fill out our call for content form and submit your idea, and we'll be happy to work with you to schedule that. And very important, please take the time to fill out the feedback form for tonight's session. This both gives us some great information about how we can continue to improve these events, as well as providing the speaker some valuable feedback on the content they presented and their own professional development. So I know it takes a few extra minutes. It's a very short form, but definitely after the session, I will post the link in the chat. And please take the time to provide feedback. Feedback is a gift, and so we very much appreciate it for everyone who's able to do that. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ian Leatherman, who will be presenting on Zero Trust and Chaos Engineering. So Ian, thank you for your time, and take it away.
All right, thanks, Nick. And good evening, everyone. So yeah, my name is Ian Leatherman. In my day job, I am a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and I'm stationed at Fleet Cyber Command in Fort Meade, Maryland, where I work for the Fleet Cyber CIO. And one of the really cool things that I've been able to do, thanks to COVID, I don't think we say that very often, but probably in this space, we say thanks to COVID, I've been able to be involved in deploying M365 for the Navy. So this started with a pilot program with US Cyber Command, and now we're getting to a point where we are deploying this for the entire Navy and doing it with a lot of what I'm going to talk about today as our core principles. So it's been a tremendous experience and opportunity for me to be the tenant owner and information system security manager to help drive some of these ideas that I'm going to show you today, drive them actually into our production environments, not only for the Navy now, but for the Department of Defense. But I will put the elephant in the room. Nick covered it really well, but this is still, this is me, Ian, talking. I don't represent the government or DoD, and I'm just going to put that on here just to make sure it's clear. But I will also say, if the government did adopt these things more uniformly, we probably wouldn't have more, we would probably have fewer issues than we have today. So hopefully in the future, these aren't Ian's ideas and concepts and briefings, and maybe this becomes government policy. But so I'm going to talk about these things, some of my favorite pictures in the world. Also this diagram. This is probably my favorite architecture diagram or concept diagram that's out there. And so this is a little preview of what I will actually get to. So first thing I'll talk about is zero trust, right? And I'm going to tie this back to M365 and how does M365 actually help you do these things. But zero trust comes down to three essential principles. And I pulled this off of Microsoft's zero trust white paper. There's lots of definitions of zero trust out there. They're all pretty much the same, but I like these definitions the most. So I'm going to use them, right? It's you verify explicitly, use least privilege access, and assume breach. Really what that boils down to is assume the bad guy is everywhere until you know for a fact that they are not, and you can prove it to a certain degree, and you constantly check for that and reassess that. That's a pretty impossible task under normal IT or traditional IT, and everything that we've built on-prem. That starts to actually get achievable though as we move to the cloud. So I'm going to come back to this diagram here. So this is actually the zero trust diagram that Microsoft puts out as part of their zero trust white paper, zero trust roadmap. And this is something that I've internalized like as a way of life in a sense. Of that you break things out into these elements, you manage them all together, and you bring them into a central security policy enforcement. So part of it is looking at identity as the core. If you don't know who you're dealing with or what they are as a machine, an API, whatever you're dealing with, if you don't know exactly who or what it is, then there's no possible way that you can defend your entire infrastructure with zero trust principles. Same thing goes now to the devices. We want to put we want to see how am I actually accessing my content. If it's a personal device, do I allow data download? Do I not? If it's a corporate device, how secure must that corporate device be? What level of updates must it be? Do I have this compliance? Do I comply to connect, conditional access type things? All of those things you have to look at. What apps am I using? What are the individual app policies, right? But you have to look at the device holistically to do that. You can't look at the management of the device separately from the defense of the device, separately from the apps. They all have to come together. And then you throw in your organizational policy that's at the top there. You feed it with all the threat intelligence you have. And ultimately, everything on the left-hand side, the top and bottom parts, come together to allow your users access, either your users or another machine, access to something that's on the right-hand side. And so that gives you access to specific data, an app, a part of the infrastructure, or even a segment of transport. Because ultimately, all of these things on the right-hand side, if you've modernized properly, all become very they're very small. You put the boundary around the smallest thing that you possibly can. So if you don't have data rights management enabled, then that might be a Word document or a PowerPoint file, right? The file itself is the smallest you can get. If you start to enable some really cool things with information protection, rights management, you can actually put that boundary around specific content inside of a file, right? So we're shrinking the boundary down to the file or down to the data as low as we can. And then based on all of these things coming together, you grant access very specifically, and everything has its own key. So one of the ways that I think about this in a non-technical way is I think about my house. And this is where I get really, really excited about this stuff, and why it's like, in a very nerdy way, my favorite things in the world is zero trust and chaos engineering, because I actually implement these at my house, right? So traditionally with your house, think of the key to your front door as a standing privilege, right? It is that key works no matter what. That key works no matter who's holding it, and it's essentially a break glass account if you think of it from our IT terms, right? There's no context there, and once you're in through that front door, you're in through any activity, any data, any resource, anything that's in your house. So what we try to do with zero trust is you want to put a lock on everything, and then you put conditions around it. So it's really hard to do in the physical world, but imagine if you had a lock around your TV and another lock around your couch. So when you come in through the front door, you're now seeing a bouncer, and the bouncer says, "Hey, who are you? I need to know who you are. I need to know where you've been." And now it's up to you, the person coming into the house, to prove all of these things. You have to prove them to this gatekeeper. And then once you prove that you haven't walked through the mud and that you are who you are and you're allowed to come into the house, you have to actually still meet the conditions to unlock the TV. And then you have to have a separate key to unlock the couch. And all of those things now combined allow you to do the activity you wanted, which was to sit on the couch with your shoes on and watch TV. All right, so now you can start to put cool conditions in there and say, you can't do that if you've walked through the mud in the last 24 hours. You have to have plastic on your shoes, and I put extra covering around you. Or you can't do it because you haven't unloaded the dishwasher. All of these conditions, right? If you imagine this in your house, it would be crazy in the physical world. But in the cloud and in the modern IT world, you can actually start to do this. And the automation part at the very bottom here, so parts I didn't talk about of this diagram, is your visibility and analytics and automation. Those have to stretch across everything. So now if you have the visibility and the automation to have a lock and key individualized for every individual asset, then you can start to apply these policies very, very, very quickly. So going back to my own personal house, I take this very internally. I don't have a standing privilege to my house, right? So there's no front door key. I have multiple layers of access, right? So if my phone has to be in a certain position, and then I go to my door and there's a pin, but the pin only works if my phone is also there. But I only need my pin if my face isn't recognized by an Windows Hello Azure service that actually can identify my face, right? So now I come into this really cool position where there's no standing privilege to my house. There's no key to lose. There's no worry of a key being lost or stolen that grants access to my house. But also, I have a better user experience. I no longer have to fumble with the key. if I have my phone with me and my face is clear in view and all these other conditions are met, then my door unlocks automatically for me as I step up to it. So I just got this perfect nirvana of a better user experience and security. And that's one of the things that I really love about this zero trust methodology and mindset is once you have done everything in this diagram and you start to get to that level on this journey, you actually get a better user experience and better security. The one thing that everybody in the world has always told us are opposites. You can never have a good user experience and security at the same time. We finally have a mechanism to do it. So that's where I get really excited about this. So then the other cool concept that I love is chaos engineering. And this is something that really originated out of Netflix, but it's running these thoughtful experiments, right? It's trying to see what happens if I do something. Think of it as like your fire drill. What happens if I do a fire drill? I want to see how people react, but you're doing this with your infrastructure, your everything about cyber. So Gremlin, it's now a company that I think they're still a company born out of what Netflix did with Chaos Monkey and provides this now as a service. And I love it because it's just break everything on your network kind of constantly to force you to automate and do everything that I just talked about with the zero trust part and force that automation. So a little bit of more of an overview of how chaos engineering came about. It's really an 11-year-old concept or 11-year-old thing in practice in IT. But originally, Netflix released their suite of Chaos Monkey, and they added to it to create this thing called the Simian Army, and everything had its role, right? You had something that would randomly go kill power to a server, something that would randomly do, and then something that would actually go turn the power back on and go fix it, right? So it's building this automation, and what it did was it actually forced the engineers to start getting sick of getting these overnight calls. And when the engineers are good, we as cyber folks are ultimately lazy, right? I think it's a human thing overall. We just have the power to fix it ourselves and to be even more lazy as a cyber engineer. So what they did was the engineers basically got sick of getting a 2 a.m. phone call that the server went down, the service is out. And then it was even more frustrating when you find out that you're woken up at 2 a.m. and it was due to a program. It was self-induced. It wasn't Mother Nature. It wasn't some bad guy, right? It was self-induced. That just gets annoying. So that's really where the Simian Army was born from, is the engineers said, I don't want to be woken up at 2 a.m. anymore. So I'm going to fix this. And the Simian Army forced the engineers to build automation into Netflix. They forced the micro-segmentation we talked about. And a lot of that started to unfold into some zero trust concepts. So it's a forcing mechanism that is why it goes hand in hand with zero trust. It's hard to get people to do zero trust, but if you kind of create a crisis, then it can help your organization, right? Get exactly what COVID is unfortunately doing for us right now. So go back to these pictures because I think that's just awesome. Chaos Monkey, the original logo there, the Simian Army together is how they all appear together in the artwork that they have, and then Gremlin on the right. No formal endorsement here of any of these companies, but this is what I do. I think it's cool technology and look across industry for it. So there's a reason to practice chaos engineering, right? It's easy to think of, why do you run a fire drill, right? Well, part of it is there's a law that forces you to do it as a company every so often to maintain a permit. But there's also there's an opportunity cost to it, right? By solving for things that might happen randomly, Mother Nature, human-related crises, by actually engineering to that and building your resilience into that and testing that, there's that savings of keeping your network up, removing the downtime, not having to have a 24/7 watch for, right? Because you have this automation in there and you keep proving to yourself that it works. So there's actually a cost benefit to this. So one of the ways that I try to build this into my network teams, so whether it's the NOC watch floor, the SOC watch floor, is just looking at the news every day. So it's kind of a practice in what if. Before you actually get the ability to do this physically or to try this out on your network and run these experiments, you can start this what if kind of thing and say, what's the crisis of the day around the world? So, if you can say, look at the power outages in Texas. What if that happened here in Maryland? Would I be prepared for that? How could I do that, right? Just start thinking through that. And this, you don't have to start big at your organizational level. Again, you think about this maybe at the personal level, right? So this is another one where I do this, it drives my wife completely crazy, but I do it constantly and say, what if that happened here? I'd actually gone through about 3 or 4 years ago, we went through a kind of a family exercise of, hey, what if there was a pandemic, right? And just thinking through that, what if we were trapped in our house for a month? And so we had actually thought through that. I had just done the thought exercise, bought a few more extra things just because. And then when COVID came around, it was like no big deal. I didn't have to rush out to the store. I never ran out of toilet paper. It can be but it becomes a way of life. And then when you incorporate this into your company or organization, you start to get the benefits of it. You start to get predictability with your watch standards. You get predictability with the crisis. The crises are now flatlined. They're not spikes that happen that create chaos themselves. You've already created the chaos artificially. You know how to control it. You know how to manage it. You know how to recover from it. And it becomes this integrated cycle. So there's this diagram here shows just how much of a community of practice chaos engineering has become. So there are tons of resources out there, tons of companies who have taken it, branched it off, done something with it to gain the benefits that I just talked about, because it's can be turned individually into what your organization needs, what your specific technology needs. I mean, I could probably show a branch here to where I've taken some of these and put it to what does a family need, right? For even non-IT related things. So there's just this really cool community of practice. And then some books that go along with it here if you really want to get into a deep dive of how this goes. So one that I actually find really interesting too is the site reliability engineering book here too. That is a little bit more of it's almost a complete overhaul of your infrastructure and network and everything else, partnering with some principles of chaos engineering. So again, that's a Google type product that was put out, but it's, I think, technology and concepts that bridge all of these, and they all come together to create this I think really cool partnership, and you start to see that enabled in other technologies. So this is who I think is the original chaos engineer. So I said this was like 11-year-old concept put in IT by Netflix, but this man has been ingrained into my career. So I originally started out as a submarine officer when I joined the Navy before coming over into the IT space. This is Admiral Hyman Rickover. So he is the father of the nuclear Navy. He's the one who said, I can take a nuclear reactor and put it on a submarine and make it run for months, years without refueling, right? And so one of those things that happens in nuclear power school and the nuclear industry with or really the nuclear community with the Navy is you drill constantly. You are practicing for the worst case scenario. You are anticipating it. So that way, when it happens, you have that muscle memory, right? And we're doing this with humans. And there's the I would argue that chaos engineering isn't actually a new concept. It's just new to IT, right? It's and the way that you can automate it and bring it into the IT space is what's new. But Admiral Rickover had this incredible challenge, right? Nuclear power is a very, very cool technology. It's very powerful. There's so many benefits to it, but you have to be prepared for the worst, because when the worst happens, it impacts the trust of society. It impacts the safety, well-being of others, right? There's a lot of issues that go with it. And of course, who is running nuclear reactors for the Navy? Who did he have to worry about as his chaos monkey? Well, that's people like me. When I was 21 years old coming out of the Navy, this was me running a nuclear reactor. And so the system has to be inherently resilient, and it has to be able to absorb the mistakes made by the chaos monkey. In the space of nuclear power, it's a human. And so that's how nuclear reactors were built. That's how our whole nuclear power program is. And that's exactly what we're trying to bring to the IT space now. It's that understanding that this is a complex industry. This is a very powerful tool. Lives are at stake, and shit happens all the time, right? So we have to be prepared for it and anticipate it. And I think this is the big thing that the government, this industry in general, is finally coming to terms with. That IT is important. IT can kill lots of people, and it's constantly breaking. Now we've got and we've got bad guys trying to do it to us. Not just Mother Nature, not just our own mistakes, but other people are trying to increase that and make it worse. So the more we can become resilient ourselves, the faster we can do that, the better. So some of these are Rickover's design and engineering principles. I kind of talked through this, but it's ultimately being effective, resilient, all these other things. I'll let you read through that. But the one thing that I think is that I'll comment on, comparing what I'm doing today with M365, with the cloud, Azure, Amazon, Google, all of these things versus nuclear power. I would say nuclear power used to be the most complex industry. It used to be the hardest thing to run and operate. But now the cloud in general, no matter which vendor's cloud it is, the cloud is far more complex than any nuclear reactor I've ever seen, that I've ever touched. There are thousands of pages more to the owner's manual of the cloud than there are for the reactor. The difference is, to learn how to go on to operate a nuclear reactor, I had years of schooling and practice and hands-on experience before that. And that technology hasn't fundamentally changed in the last 50 years. The cloud, on the other hand, is basically completely changing every 6 to 12 months. So not only is it far more complex, not only is there more documentation to it, but it's also changing. So you have to be constantly up to speed. And so if you think finding a qualified, competent nuclear power operator is hard, try doing that in the cloud, right? And that's the part that I think is what we as a society have to come to terms with, and why integrating these things into IT is so important, especially today. These are all things that he put out to Congress right in the 80s. So high quality materials, tracking your supply chain, concentrate on the designing, building, and operating, right, to prevent accidents, not just cope with accidents that could occur. These are all things that that really correlate to the chaos engineering principles. And it's something that, again, not representing the government here, because I'm going to criticize the government and say, we as the US, government as a whole, are not taking these things into account. These are things that we learned with nuclear power and we're doing effectively. we are not doing in our IT space. So we need to introduce some chaos engineering into our daily lives with our business lives here, to bring these principles to light, right? Maybe I need the higher licensing. Maybe I do need those additional logs that and automation capabilities that come with that E5 license, because by doing so, I can prevent things, right? Just not new principles. So ultimately, this is somebody from Google with the site reliability engineering, use the culture check. Can you even do this? Are you looking at mistakes that happen or things that happen and fixing them, making sure they can never happen again? Based on recent breaches we've had, I would say we're not learning this lesson, right? So again, we have to look internally and fix ourselves. And that starts at our level, I would say, with the IT. So now you got super excited and you're like, wow, I love chaos engineering. I want to go do it. And I want to go break stuff, right? Well, not quite, because just like you don't want to run a fire drill right off the bat with your people, to say, hey, I'm going to light a match to make you take this stuff seriously. That creates chaos. People can get hurt, just like what Dwight did in the office. So we want to make sure you do the basics, have the plans, make sure everything is defined, what you're actually testing. Don't go test everything all at once. You could start with, hey, what if I lose my fiber connection? Or what if I lose my Azure AD connection and the methodology I have for my admin credentials goes down? Do I have a break glass account? Start testing one thing at a time and then evolve from there. Build this process. So, and this is pretty much scientific method of, you create a hypothesis, you inject your failure, measure it, roll back, go fix it. Right? Break fast, do this constantly, expand your scope, and then automate it, right? So this is kind of the conclusion that I come to in a lot of networks I look at, right? If I were to take all of the things of the Simian Army as Netflix created them and as they've evolved in their many branches today, it would be a complete catastrophic failure. And so the question is it even possible to build an inherently resilient and secure network? And that's really where the cloud comes in, right? So I love the Cloud Native Compute Foundation is another thing that I have discovered in my journey of IT. I like what they stand for, the fact that they are starting, all cloud native and modular, immutable infrastructures. All of these things is what they're trying to build from day one, which again gets you to your zero trust infrastructure. So I would say arguably you could make a chaos engineering proof infrastructure using all of these things. The tools are out there. It is possible if you're ready for it. Actually, we'll go back. And so this gets to really the conversation of the cloud, right? So I talk about cloud native compute. All of these things exist individually in a lot of places. So when you look at so the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, these guys are who started. I just blanked on the name of what it's called, but it's the individualized containers, very similar to Kubernetes. There we go. So they started all the Kubernetes stuff, containerization, right? But if you've ever actually tried to do that stuff, it's really hard unless you've automated it and you've automated your deployment of those containers. It's really hard. And that's just for individualized apps or functionalities. If you start bringing in identity services into that, that's a whole nother level of complexity. When you start introducing actual network infrastructure into that, it's really hard. And then you have endpoint management on top of that. And then you try to do an EDR solution on top of that for defending the endpoint. It just gets out of hand really fast. So this is where, personally for me, right, M365 comes into play, because a lot of those capabilities come out of the box. So one of the things that I've loved playing with is the endpoint management capabilities of Intune with Defender for Endpoint on there. and right, the built-in stuff that you get. So you get this containerization of apps on the endpoint right off the bat. The corresponding reach back into them goes into the cloud. And now from a cloud standpoint, I can manage that app. I can manage the session of that app. It's its own individualized lock and key. So if I have a bad guy who's stolen that session, they can't move to every other workload that I have. Unlike you would traditionally have authentication done with your domain controllers. So you start to get all of these elements of zero trust out of the box, and it completely simplifies your actual execution if you go kind of like the whole package, right? And M365 is not going to do everything for you. It doesn't help you with the management of your actual network infrastructure and perform microsegmentation that way and things like that. But I'd say it probably gets you maybe 80% towards your zero trust journey right out of the box, right? And this is where, again, with COVID, we actually had really fascinating experiences with this to accelerate it, because it was, how do I gain control of my endpoints from the internet that aren't necessarily VPN'd, and everybody's branched off, right? So that's actually the machine that I'm presenting from is Intune managed with MDE on it, and has been beat up by 3 or 4 of the best red teams DoD has to offer, and it's held up, connected straight to the internet. But it's only, the endpoint's only as good as the infrastructure. So with the corresponding MCAS services for cloud application security and the corresponding identity management, conditional access policies, all of those things going together from that zero trust diagram I showed, all of those things working in harmony is where you can finally start to enable both the user experience so that I can present this to you, but also the security and adversarial detection and the response to that adversarial detection being built in. Just trying to provide as much resiliency for any scenario that could come up, whether that's a snowstorm, actual bad guy, or a pandemic. So pending any questions, that is where I will pause.
Absolutely. Well, I have a number of questions I'd like to kick off while anyone else decides. So the first question I had was, and you kind of touched on this. So there's kind of I think a thesis that's part of the design of Microsoft 365. You know, we talk about it a lot in Microsoft in terms of the value of the integrated suite, right? And all the different components, you know, the fact that, you know, there's some level of coupling between the identity, the endpoint management, or there can be, you know, email, the productivity applications. From kind of your experience so far, and you were talking a little bit about this, is that something that you've really found as valuable in achieving the zero trust and some of these chaos engineering principles? Because I know the kind of traditional practice is that best of breed, right, where you pick a bunch of products, you do a bunch of work to integrate them together, and you have this amazing interlocked fabric, which sounds great on paper, but at least in my experience, has been kind of hard to achieve. So can you speak a little bit about just like at least what your personal experience has been in regards to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where it's almost a little counterintuitive. And actually, I'm going to talk about how I've done this at my house a little bit more than anything. But by moving to M365 holistically, right? So I can tell you what M365 products enable everything on this diagram, and say, yes, there's a product to do that. It fits somewhere, and the integration is built in out of the box. But by doing that, it actually allows me to have a more diversified and vendor agnostic infrastructure. And I think that's the part that's counterintuitive in this whole process is the faster you get to M365, the faster you can incorporate and build resiliency with other vendors, other products, and enable other opportunities. Still having M365 as a core platform on that, right? But when you look at where is your data stored, everything on the right-hand side here, right? It's where is your data? What apps are you using? All of your infrastructure as a whole. I really don't care where that sits anymore. And this is what becomes the force multiplier of M365, in my opinion, is, if you want to, and personally, if I'm storing all of my data in the M365 bucket, then I failed at chaos engineering, right? Because I should plan for Microsoft to be taken off the earth someday. I should just plan on that. How likely is it? Probably very low, but as a good chaos engineer, I want to see how that works, right? So I'm going to probably put my data also on Amazon, and I'm going to put it on-prem, and I'm going to put it all these places. But at the end of the day, I need to make sure that that data is still secure. I also need to assume that Amazon is breached, and I need to assume that Microsoft is breached, and I need to assume that my house gets broken into and my hard drives are stolen. So I need a mechanism to secure that. I need a mechanism to detect those things and respond to them and automate that, right? And this is where you start getting into, you have Sentinel, you have your playbooks, you have the built-in integration of that into Security Center for how your endpoints go and your identity, right? So it starts to, you get to start using all of the toys that are out there, because now you actually have some place to plug them into. Another way I think about this is, and actually I'll build off of our NASA presentation that we had before, is like satellite construction, right? It's the bus payload kind of construction. I see M365 as the bus, right? It's the backbone of what you're doing. And then that enables your customers, your users, to bring their own payload. And we don't really need to care what that payload is anymore. This helps the accreditation process. This helps risk reduction, because as long as they're plugging in to your bus in the spot that they're supposed to, in the mechanism that they are, that they're directed to, and you enforce that all through automation, what they bring to the table doesn't matter anymore. And that's the nice thing about containerization and this whole thing. So I know this is probably not the right place to say this, but I'm not a fan of single vendor, right? I'm not a fan of any of that, because it goes against the chaos engineering. But the faster you get to M365, the faster you can actually diversify and build that resilient infrastructure holistically.
No, that makes perfect sense, Ian. And I mean, I think even while Microsoft, certainly I can say with some confidence that we certainly want everybody to leverage and benefit from our products. I don't think even Satya would tell you that we expect to be a single vendor for everything. So my second question, and then hopefully some other folks will have some questions, is, so when it comes to the kind of introduction, and we're seeing more and more use of AI, especially as an actor, right, in automation, right? I think about, really autopilots and planes, right? And we're seeing more driving cars, and especially with computing, we're seeing AI is really enabling a lot of scenarios. But at least in my mind, the AI becomes a new chaos monkey. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that, in terms of either how that potentially helps and benefits some of those principles, or introduces some new risks that need to be accounted for?
Yeah, so actually that's a great point. And I'm gonna actually bring up some real world fun that we've had as part of that. And so it's definitely a new level of chaos monkey, right? And it's actually, the adversaries are using it wonderfully against us, wonderfully for them. So if you look at TrickBot and Emotet specifically, which of course, right, Microsoft had a huge arm in taking down, or at least taking a giant chunk out of, but it's such an ingrained crazy botnet that it started coming back fiercely. But when you look at what that did, that starts to destroy the old premise that you can just have antivirus, that you can have signature-based detection. And this is actually, so going back to I'm going to go back to my home analogy here, right? In the past, if you have signature-based detection that says, hey, are you a bad guy? Can you come into my house or not? And that's done with the lock and key or a pin or something like that. You really have to replace your front door with the bouncer. And the bouncer is not looking for a specific person, right? They're not there with the clipboard saying you're allowed in the house because you are whitelisted, and you're on the list and you get to come in. You have to be looking for the bad behavior, and that is the key here, right? And so that comes into this whole big chaos monkey or chaos engineering aspect. Is the behavioral analytics is the future. You have to be looking for the behavior because everybody's got their own disguise. And what we saw with TrickBot and Emotet is the signature of what the malware looked like was changing every few minutes, right? So if you're reliant on traditional antivirus to protect your endpoints, then you're out of luck. You're not going to catch that bad activity. And then again, I'll come back to why you have to go to this integrated platform. We actually caught this. So you have the threat intelligence, knowing how this thing is evolving, knowing what signatures to look for next, what behaviors to look for. So that's feeding into your policy enforcement, looking for that both on the endpoints, but also for where it's moving, trying to get your data, your apps, your infrastructure. And that's actually the only way we were able to catch it, right? Is having Defender for Endpoint as that EDR capability and finding the actual bad behavior, even if the signature, that specific variant, was never before seen in the wild. And so, we got lucky with that. We got lucky that we had that EDR capability, but that absolutely has to be part of your internal chaos engineering now is change the game, right? Don't, one day you lit a match to set the fire alarm off. The next day, launch a firework, change the signature because you never know what it's going to be. Hopefully that explains or addresses that AI question, Nick.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I mean, it's certainly not a there's a whole big topic to unpack there, but yeah, I like your view of it. Who else? I'm sure we must have some other questions for Ian. This is definitely an interesting subject.
Well, while I wait for another question, Nick, I'll actually add another element to your other question because I really, I mean, that's such an important thing. I mean, I just having flashbacks to our Emotet TrickBot days, which are very recent. But the layered security on this, right? So I'm going to just keep this diagram up for a while because each one of these things individually might catch a bad guy, right? They might catch your insider threat. They might catch your Snowden, right? But together, it gives you a heck of a lot better detection radius, right? So in one case, we caught it on the endpoint with Defender for Endpoint. In another case, we actually caught it up in the cloud because it was from a compromised Word document that was actually being put up into M365. And we caught the behavior there before it actually had a chance to go to the endpoint. So because of having all these censorings and everything going through this policy enforcement mechanism, you actually have multiple times to actually catch the bad guy, right? It's not this linear process of boundary defenses like you would have traditionally. You're looking for the bad guy with lots of different mechanisms, lots of different times. And I think that's the other important thing to look at here as well is it's not a one size fits all. I can't tell you that you're going to be secure if you just deploy Defender for Endpoint and an EDR on your workstation. But if you combine that with identity monitoring, with protections in the cloud for, Defender for M365, you might actually catch the bad guy in one of those things because they'll slip up, right? It's if you have the cameras searching for your house and they're visible spectrum, but you also have infrared, but you also have motion detectors, all of that on top of it, the bad guy might get around 3 of those defenses, but you're catching with a 4th, right? That's the other part that I want to take into account, and why, again, to your earlier point, Nick, of the integration part, that is again so important. Is if you're treating all of these things separately, if your endpoint data is going into one database, but your identity is in another database, and they're never being correlated, you will never find your bad guys. So anyway, I'll get off that soapbox, but that's such a huge point as well.
No, great point. It looks like Sam has a question, and then I think Josh.
Yes. Hey, Ian. Thank you very much for this. This is really good stuff. I actually work for Planet and in the West Division, and we're starting to kind of grow out this sort of offering, like helping clients work through zero trust. And I was wondering, like I said, I've worked for the DoD before, and change can be slow. Basically, I was kind of curious, moving people away from castle and moat to this idea of zero trust. Like, what do you recommend bringing up, or like what kind of tactics do you recommend? Because I know there's kind of some resistance to some of this stuff, just because there's a lot of old school ideas about IT. I just wondered, what experience you had. Thanks.
Yeah. So this, I'm just going to say it. My start a pandemic. If you want to start, that's the sad answer to this, but that's the only reason that we have this kind of change happening today. And it's sad is we still didn't even have this immediate change right off the bat. It was, hey, everybody go telework. And then, but our solution to you teleworking is we're going to increase VPN capacity. And so that tiered defense style was still the way of thinking in this pandemic. Where we started getting lucky was we actually started with MDE and deployed that out because it didn't require a firewall change, and we were able to push it out to all of our folks, because what we found out is users are smart, users are creative, and we were blind when off VPN. And so once we had the data on the endpoints to show, hey, your users are, the VPN's not working, people are browsing the internet off VPN, people are doing all this stuff. Oh, and by the way, we're starting to see these threats. And then starting to show, hey, we caught this in the cloud or the endpoint, or we saw this on the endpoint, but it would have been caught in the cloud if we did that. Starting to show that picture was really valuable to us. But honestly, I had tried to do this twice before in the Navy, based on exercises that we had, and they both got denied because they were seen as too risky and unnecessary. So really, third time was the charm, and it was only because of the pandemic, and it was because of a blind spot we had that we even got our foot in the door. So, that's also the sad reality of I think, again, where our government as a whole is, and the nature of our thought process. Legacy still wins the day, even at the end of this, a year into this pandemic. Legacy mindset still has the day, even after SolarWinds, even after all of the other on-prem disasters that have happened in the last 3 months, which would all be mitigated by moving to this infrastructure. There is still the precedent, the preference for legacy on-prem, because people just don't know better. So hopefully this presentation will help educate folks that there is a way, there is a future, there is a way to do it, and they should move on to it. But I sadly don't have a good answer to how to do this without a pandemic, because that was the key to our success.
All right, Josh, I think you had a question.
Yeah, hello, Ian. Quick question here as you're walking through chaos engineering and building out resiliency and anti-fragility and mission assurance. Have you had a chance yet to play with MDE Evaluation Lab and security validation tools like Median security validation or the Red Canary atomic testing? Have you been able to kind of go through and test with different threat TTPs yet?
So we've done a little bit of that. but actually I've let let the pros do that. There's actually a new MITRE evaluation that just got published today that starts to do that. And this is I think one of the interesting things is, so first of all, I'm an ops guy. Luckily, I don't have to worry about the acquisitions of this stuff and showing the acquisitions related data. But from an ops standpoint, the capability for the endpoint is not as important, right? The value we get for protecting the endpoint, sure, it matters how good your EDR is on the endpoint. It does matter, but that's not the only way I can find bad guys. There's actually lots of ways around MDE. There's ways to silence MDE. That's a fact of life for any endpoint security tool. But knowing that it's been silenced, because you have the hook into it with the cloud, you can see the sessions to the actual apps and you know how those things are going. That's again where the magic is. So that's a tricky question, and I would defer to, again, looking at this holistically and assessing it holistically and throwing all of your, throwing everything you have at the MITRE attack framework against this diagram as a whole versus any one part of it, because any one part of it will fail, but as a whole, you might just have a fighting chance.
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with the MITRE attack framework and have worked with it for a number of years. And, just in terms of the threat emulation, it does set up an opportunity there as you're doing security validation to use what you understand about those different name sets and purposely apply them, right? So applying some of your chaos principle, that chaos engineering principle, you can then use MDE as an enabler to do that emulation. So either you have someone from Red Team come and do a threat emulation there, right? Aggressor squadron kind of approach, or just in terms of exercising the system, here are your standard TTPs and here are your response methodologies and maneuver architectures, right? So just to put this in practice, there some of those capabilities are built into the infrastructure already. So I wasn't sure if you're aware, but there's some really powerful things that Microsoft has baked in already.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate that. And actually, the one thing that I'll say too, for the benefit of the group, that and actually buying confidence, right? Traditionally, we used to do all this stuff with red teams exclusively, right? So the red team would beat it up. They would have a report at the end of the day. It says, here's how crappy your system was, and here's why. And they're the ones that get to use all these cool tools, right? Part of that script got flipped to us last October when US Cybercom actually directed some purple teaming to happen. And that forced everybody to do an open analysis of this. So we actually got to, as the blue forces, as the people actually operating this, we got to play with those tools and we got to do it with red team. And that was probably the most valuable thing that's ever happened in my network management career to date, because in a week of purple teaming where red team said, hey, I'm going to fire this effect, and we got to watch that in real time, and we knew what we were looking for. We could tune the system, we could apply policies, and we actually got to now play with those tools that we traditionally would have been blind to and work hand in hand. And it raised the skill level of our blue forces considerably, right? It was like 6 months worth of what would have taken 6 months worth of training just happened in a week, because they actually got to do it live and for real. And then we follow that with red teaming, but that purple teaming was huge because of the use of those tools that you were just describing. So I think that's a huge lesson learned that I would present to everyone here as well, is don't be afraid to open up your red teams for the sake of training your blue forces. And it also helped the red team learn some new TTPs as well, because they knew how the blue forces started to learn, and it brought everybody's skill level to a whole nother level.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the group? This has been a great discussion. All right. Well, I will take that as a no. So, Ian, thank you so much for sharing this information. I definitely learned a lot and found this to be fascinating. I will confess I was not that familiar with chaos engineering, but you've given me a whole bunch of interesting stuff to dive into. So I'm excited to start learning some more about this because it definitely makes a lot of sense.
Well, thanks, Nick, and appreciate the opportunity and really appreciate the Q&A with everyone. So I think Nick put my LinkedIn in the invite to this. If anybody has questions or would like further questions or would like to deep dive, especially if government would like to deep dive on what we've done specifically as the Navy in a government forum, I'm also more than happy to do that as well and share lessons learned. And even if we have to go classified, more than welcome to do that. So just throwing that out there for everyone. So thanks again, Nick. Really, really do appreciate it.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for taking the time to be a speaker. And I don't know if you saw, but I put in the chat, I actually found it's not as extensive as your content, but there's actually a Microsoft Docs article on chaos engineering. So it's definitely not just a Navy nuclear concept. It's it's taken a life of its own.
Perfect.
So I'm very excited. Yeah. So with that in mind, definitely please, if everyone has a chance, would love to get your feedback through the feedback form, both on the great content that Ian presented, as well as these sessions overall, and anything you'd either like to see in the future or ideas of what could make these better. I do also want to just highlight our public sector tech communities. So if you're not familiar with these are a great Microsoft hosted resource with forums, blog posts, all sorts of great content on case studies and other information. So certainly a great community to collaborate in. And there are also the Microsoft Azure Government DC Meetup group, which is very similar to this one, but is more focused on the kind of IaaS and PaaS cloud scenarios versus the SaaS offerings. If you're also familiar, there's also the Nova 365 users group. Formerly, I believe it was known as the DC SharePoint users group, but they've broadened their scope a bit. And there's also the Microsoft Government DC users group, who's run by Jeremy Wood, and they have a lot of great content and sessions as well. If you're familiar in this topic, so certainly encourage everyone to check them out. And with that, I will wrap up and close here, but feel free to stay on if there's any further conversations that folks want to have. And thank you again, everyone, for attending, and we will see you May 18th.